Today, we'll be talking about operant conditioning. So, operant versus classical conditioning. So, with classical conditioning, you can teach a dog to salivate, but you cannot teach it to sit up or roll over. Why is that? Right? Salivation is an involuntary reflex, while sitting up and rolling over are far more complex responses that we think of as voluntary. And that's the key difference. And I'll post, like, I have like a little like key notes to this unit that I'll post. But classical is involuntary. You learn it without realizing you're learning it. Operant is a choice, so that's voluntary. So whenever you do something with operant conditioning that we're about to talk about, whether it's positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, negative punishment, it is in the end up to you whether you choose to do it. Where classical conditioning is involuntary. So operant conditioning, right? An operant is just an observable behavior that an organism uses to operate in the environment. So operant conditioning, right, what we're talking about here, is a form of learning in which the probability of a response is changed by its consequences, that is, by the stimuli that follows the response. Therefore, an operant behavior is behavior that operates on the environment to produce rewards and punishments. All right, so it seems like a lot, but we're going to break it down into those four things I just mentioned: positive, negative, punishment, and reinforcements. Just remember, operant is a voluntary choice that you have. So B.F. Skinner. Remember I said you need to know people for each thing, so we have Pavlov with classical conditioning, Garcia with food aversion. We've talked a little bit about Watts, and he's the one who kind of coined behaviorism with the Baby Albert experiment. Skinner, though, is probably the most famous of the behaviorists, right? So B.F. Skinner became famous for his ideas in behaviorism and his work with rats and pigeons, like we talked about earlier. So make sure you know Skinner is with behaviorism. There's also something called the law of effect, right? And this is by Edward Thorndike. So make sure you know he's kind of like the fifth person that you really need to know. Thorndike came up with the law of effect. And all this is saying is it's the idea that responses that produce desirable results would be learned or stamped into the organism. So the law of effect is just saying if you do something and you get a positive result from it, now you're more likely to do that again. All right. And I'll post a video of a cat learning to do something. It got a reward it liked, so it's going to keep doing that behavior again. That's all the law of effect says. So the Skinner box, also called the operant chamber. The Skinner created a box that had a bar that an animal pressed to receive a reward, like usually food or water. The device then recorded the response. And you can kind of see here the one on the left working with the pigeons, the one on the right working with rats. I've showed you the video before where they had to cross the electric grid and press a lever to get their hypothalamus stimulated. Same concept, right? So this is known as the Skinner box or the operant chamber. This is just a blown up picture so you can get a little better detail of it. So reinforcement. A reinforcer is a condition in which the presentation or removal of a stimulus that occurs after a response, which is the behavior, and strengthens that response or makes it more likely to happen again in the future. So when we talk about reinforcements, it always has to increase behavior, whether it's positive reinforcement or negative reinforcement, it always increases the behavior. That's the key thing. So, a lot students do struggle with this a little bit until they kind of understand the principles. Reinforcements increase behavior. Whether it's good or bad behavior doesn't matter. As long as it increases behavior, that is considered a reinforcement. Positive and negative. Positive isn't good, negative isn't bad. Positive is adding something to this situation, negative is taking something away. Therefore, positive reinforcement is a stimulus presented after a response that increases the probability of that response happening again. So if you get paid for good grades, you're more likely to do it. I've had students talk about when they stopped getting paid for it, then their grades got worse. I mentioned earlier also how some psychologists became animal trainers. The best way to train animals, if you see in a circus or any kind of animal show, they're constantly feeding them. They're not doing that because the animal's necessarily hungry. They're doing that to reward them for behavior. So they want to keep the animal acting that way. So that's positive reinforcement. So you add something, which is, so in this scenario, is you add the money to keep getting good grades. Negative reinforcement. This is probably the hardest concept we kind of talk about all year because I mean, it is confusing, and depending on how the scenario is written, it can get really confusing. So negative reinforcement, it's the removal of an unpleasant or adverse stimulus that increases the probability that the response happens again. Right? So negative means you're taking something away, like remember it says at the bottom there. Positive means you add something. But reinforcement means you want to increase the behavior. So what you're doing here, you're taking something away to increase the behavior. So an example could be taking Advil to get rid of a headache because you want to increase the behavior of being headache free. Putting on a seatbelt to make the annoying seatbelt buzzer stop, right? So you're taking away the annoying sound to get the desired result, which is for you to wear a seatbelt. Now, this is where it can get tricky. If the scenario is written like your kid's crying at the grocery store, so you give him candy to shut him up. And now every time you go to the grocery store, he asks or he cries so he can get candy. Now, at first you think that's negative reinforcement, but it's actually positive reinforcement because you're adding the candy, so you're rewarding his bad behavior. Is essentially what you're doing, right? So you give him candy. Now he knows every time he goes to the grocery store, hey, if I cry, I'm going to get candy. So it's actually positive reinforcement, even though it's not necessarily a good behavior. Continuous reinforcement is a reinforcement schedule under which all correct responses are reinforced. This is a useful tactic early in the learning process. It is also helps when shaping new behavior. So that's a vocab word, shaping. So continuous reinforcement is just, you every time you do it, you get a reinforcement. Shaping is when you're trying to learn something new. It's a technique where the new behavior is produced by reinforcing responses that are similar to the desired response. So a couple examples. One is, let's say I'm trying to do a cartwheel, or I'm trying to teach like my kid how to do a cartwheel. Well, I reward the first time they just attempt to do it. I reward that behavior, but then I don't reward them until they make a little bit of progress. And then I don't reward them again until they make a little bit more progress. And then I don't reward them again until they do like a perfect cartwheel, right? That shaping is where you reward the attempt, and then you gradually keep rewarding them, but only if they make progress. So I'll post a video of this training a dog. So they use this for training dogs, right? So the first time they're trying to teach a dog to roll over. First they give a treat, and they literally have to roll it over itself. And then they keep trying to do that, and they give the dog a treat, but only, first just when they roll it over, and then just for attempting to roll it over. And then by the end, they only give it a treat when it actually does roll over by itself. That's shaping. Punishment. A punishment is an adverse or disliked stimulus which occurs after a behavior. And key thing, it decreases the probability it will occur again. So remember, reinforcements increase the probability of happening again. Punishments decrease the probability of happening again. So positive punishment is an undesirable event that follows a behavior. So like getting spanked after telling a lie. You're adding the spanking to stop the behavior of lying. So remember, punishment decreases behavior, positive adds something. So you're always adding something to stop a behavior. Like maybe you add a jail sentence or add a timeout to stop the behavior that got them in trouble. So positive is you add something to decrease behavior. Positive punishment is. So negative punishment, when a desirable event ends or is taken away after a behavior. So an example is getting grounded from your cell phone after failing your progress report. So think of a timeout, right? Taking away time from a fun activity with the hope that it will stop the unwanted behavior in the future. So that's, in that way, a timeout is like when you take away something you're doing, not just like adding it to the scenario. So negative punishment, I think, is one of the easiest things. Is so pretty much whenever a privilege is taken away to stop the behavior, that's negative punishment. So remember, negative is you take something away. So take pretty much any privilege that's taken away to decrease that behavior, right? So you get in trouble, you take away, your Xbox, your PlayStation, your cell phone, whatever it might be. So here's just a little matrix to maybe try to visualize it a little bit. So we'll start up, this row right here. The consequence provides something. So it could be money, a spanking, whatever it might be. So this is positive. You want to add something to it. So positive reinforcement um, in this side. So the consequence over here, reinforcement, the consequence makes the behavior more likely to happen in the future. So if I add something, let's say I add money to keep you getting good grades. So I add something to keep the behavior going. So positive punishment, I add something to decrease the behavior. So punishment, remember, decreases the behavior. So that's what we're talking about here. So that would be I add a spanking to decrease your misbehavior. Now negative, this column, consequence takes away something. Could be the removal of a headache, could be timeout, whatever. So here, if I negative reinforcement, if you take Advil to take away the headache to get the desired result, that'd be negative reinforcement. Negative punishment is taking away any privilege to decrease the behavior. So unlike reinforcement, punishment must be administered consistently. Intermittent punishment is far less effective than punishment delivered after every undesirable behavior. In fact, not punishing every misbehavior can have the effect of rewarding the behavior. So reinforcement, you don't want to reinforce every single time once they've learned something. So once, the animal, the child, whatever you're talking about, has learned, from that positive reinforcement, you don't reinforce every single time. You do it randomly. Because if you do it every single time and then one time you don't reinforce them, they think they're being punished or, they think they're being mistreated when really you just didn't reinforce them for doing something they should have already been doing. So reinforcement, once learned, you do it randomly. But punishment, you has to be consistent every time, right? Because if you're not being punished consistently, now it's like you got away with something, right? And you never want to, have like a bad behavior that you felt like you got away with, because now they're going to keep doing that behavior. So it has to be consistent. If you look at, even if you look at different high schools, some high schools that have better behavior, it's because they know if they do something, they're going to be punished every single time, not randomly. Like some students be like, oh, I can get away with it. Oh, that's my dean. It's fine. Where I know some schools, it's so like my wife's school where she teaches, if they chew gum, it's 3 detentions. Doesn't matter who the dean is. It's automatic, right? So it's very consistent, so they don't have as many behavioral issues. So punishment versus negative reinforcement. This is the one that people get confused a lot, and it is confusing. In fact, I've had conversations where psychology teachers argue over it, and a lot of it has to do with, I think, the way it's worded. So punishment and negative reinforcement are used to produce opposite effects on behavior. If you remember, punishment is used to decrease a behavior or reduce its probability of reoccurring. Negative reinforcement always increases a behavior's probability of happening in the future. So taking away an unwanted stimulus. So you're always going to be taking that Advil again to keep the desired result. So remember, positive means adding something and negative means removing something. So as long as you remember the key things, positive add, negative take away, reinforcement increases behavior, punishment decreases behavior, you should be okay. And we'll have some sample problems. And I'll post some videos to help explain it as well. So uses and abuses of punishment. Punishment is often produces an immediate change in behavior, which ironically reinforces the punisher. So it actually does more to the punisher. So like, let's say you're given the spanking. It actually does more to the person giving the spanking than it does to the actual person getting spanked. Because it's like, oh, the behavior stops, so I'm going to keep on hitting, this person, spanking them. However, punishment rarely works in the long run for these 4 reasons. So punishment is a good short-term, thing to do. But if your aim is long-term behavior change, it's not good. And the first reason is the power of punishment to suppress behavior usually disappears when the threat of punishment is gone. So let's say your dad is always the punisher, and you act great when your dad's around because you don't want to be punished. But as soon as he leaves, now you act a fool, right? So it only works if that threat is around you. So that's not really, long-term learning going on there. Number 2, punishment triggers escape or aggression. So when we're punished, it's never a good thing. We never feel good when we're being punished. So it triggers these negative emotions, right? Like of escape and aggression. So if you get in trouble in school, and you were punished in school. Now you escape. Now you don't want to like pay attention in your classes, or maybe you want to act aggressive. The third reason, punishment makes the learner apprehensive, inhibits learning. So essentially what I just said, right? If you're being punished with those negative emotions, you're probably not going to be learning a lot. And the last reason, punishment is often applied unequally. So rarely is punishment even. Remember I said it must be consistent, but I hear students all the time say, oh, that's my dean, I can get away with it. Oh, that's your dean, you're going to get in trouble, right? It should be the same no matter who your dean is. Or think about like siblings. Oh, she always gets away with everything. Oh, I did the same thing and I didn't get in trouble. Or I did get in trouble and you didn't, right? So because punishment is often applied unequally, it doesn't tend to work. So we know punishment doesn't work in the long run, but there are some things you can do to have it be, most effective. One thing is it should be swift. So you should do it right away. As soon as the behavior is done, they should be punished right away. If you're doing it hours, weeks, months later, it's not going to work, right? It needs to happen. The punishment needs to happen as soon as the misbehavior happens. Punishment should be certain every time, right? Like I was mentioning earlier, if you did something, you should be punished for it. Otherwise, you feel like you got away with something. Punishment should be limited in time and intensity. So you might have heard like, oh, a timeout, 1 minute for a 1-year-old, 2 minutes for a 2-year-old, things like that. If it's extreme, that doesn't really help anything. So it should be limited in time as long as, they get a consequence. But if it's too harsh, now you're going to have negative effects. Punishment should clearly target the behavior, not the person. And this is key. So when you're punishing someone, it's not that you have to say, not that I don't like you, I don't like the behavior that you did. It's not you as a person, it's the behavior that you did. And that's key because otherwise, especially, younger children, they think it's them and not necessarily just the behavior that they did. They just think they're a bad person. So that's where it can get a little dicey at times. You want to make sure you're focusing on the behavior, not the person. Punishment should not give mixed messages, right? So if you're being punished, you shouldn't be having a good time. Your punishment, if you get sent to your room, but your room has Xbox, TVs and all this other stuff, that's not really a punishment. So I remember years ago, the in-school room used to be like a party room. And so people used to want to go to in-school. Well, that wasn't a punishment, right? That's giving mixed messages. So punishment shouldn't be something you want to do. And lastly, the most effective punishment is often omission training, which is negative punishment. So negative punishment works a lot better than positive punishment. So it's better to take away a privilege than it is to apply like a spanking or something like that. And you can think about that in like the world as well, right? It's better to take maybe away the privilege of driving than it is to give like a 5-year jail sentence for something. Intermittent reinforcement. So a type of reinforcement schedule by which some, but not all correct responses are reinforced. So intermittent reinforcement is the most effective way to maintain a desired behavior that has already been learned. So like I said earlier, once you learn something, you shouldn't get reinforced every time, right? Because then you come to expect it. You should just, do the behavior, and then if you get rewarded, you get rewarded, and you feel good whenever that happens. Continuous reinforcement, like we mentioned earlier, a scheduled reinforcement that rewards every correct response given. So an example of this would be like a vending machine. Theoretically, you put money in, you should get something out. Now we know they don't always work like that, but theoretically that's continuous reinforcement. Every time you do something, you get a response. So think, is there anything else that might be an example of continuous reinforcement? As you're going through this, hopefully you're thinking of your own personal examples as much as possible. So schedules of intermittent reinforcement. There's 4 we're going to talk about. So interval schedule rewards subjects after a certain time interval. That's key. Ratio schedule rewards subjects after a certain number of responses. So anytime we're dealing with time, whether it's seconds, days, hours, whatever, we're dealing with intervals. Anytime we're dealing with number of responses or behaviors, we're talking about ratio schedule. So here are the 4 types of intermittent reinforcement we'll be talking about on the next slides. We got fixed interval schedule, variable interval schedule, fixed ratio schedule, and variable ratio schedule. So a fixed interval schedule, right? So we know it's interval, so it has to do with time. So it's a schedule that rewards a learner only for the first correct response after some defined period of time. So remember, fixed is it's set, right? So it's not random or anything like that. It's a set amount of time. So an example, B.F. Skinner puts rats in a box with a lever connected to a feeder. It only provided reinforcement after 60 seconds. The rats quickly learned that it didn't matter how early or often it pushed the lever, it had to wait a set amount of time. As the set amount of time came to an end, the rats became more active in hitting the lever because it knew every 60 seconds. It wasn't random, it was every 60 seconds it got rewarded. Think about like paychecks, whether you get paid every week or every 2 weeks. You know that's a fixed interval because it deals with time and it's set. It's not randomly. It's like, oh, sometimes 5 days, sometimes 6 days, sometimes 7. It's set. Every 2 weeks you get paid. Interval schedules. So variable interval schedules, a reinforcement system that rewards a correct response after an unpredictable amount of time. So remember, variable means unpredictable. It's random. You don't know when it's going to happen. So an example of this could be a pop quiz, right? So it deals with time, but you don't know when it's going to happen. It could happen any time. And so pop quizzes can be very effective to get students to read. Something I've often thought about implementing. Fixed ratio schedule, a reinforcement schedule that rewards a response only after a defined number of correct answers. So an example here, at Safeway, if you use your club card to buy 7 Starbucks coffees, you get the 8th one for free, right? It's a reward. Buy 7, you get 1 free. Right, so it's set. It has nothing to do with time. You can do it within a week. You can do it within a month. Time doesn't matter here. It's behaviors, it's responses. So pretty much any type of reward system is going to be a fixed ratio schedule. Think about like credit card. Oh, every $10 you spend, you get $1 back. A dollar cash reward, something like that. As long as it's set and it's based off behaviors, that is a fixed ratio. Variable ratio, a reinforcement schedule that rewards an unpredictable number of correct responses. Example, buying a lottery ticket. So pretty much any type of gambling is going to be a variable ratio schedule. So the more you do it, the more likely you are to win, but you don't know when you're going to win. If you did, everyone would gamble and we all would be rich. That's not how it works. But the more you play, the more likely you are to win. Now, you're also more likely to lose, but this is a variable ratio schedule. Right? So you play your response, the desired response you're going to get, winning, is random. It's unpredictable. You don't know when it's going to happen. That is why it's a variable ratio schedule. So think about anything you do. The more you do it, the more likely you are to win, but you don't know when it's going to happen. So schedules reinforcement. You can just kind of see a graph here of the fixed ratio, variable ratio, fixed interval, and variable interval. So Skinner's laboratory pigeons produces these responses patterns to each of the 4 reinforcement schedules. For people, as for pigeons, research linked to number of responses, which is ratio, produces a higher response rate than reinforcements linked to time, which is interval. So if you see the fixed interval, variable interval those are high responses. Then you have the variable interval. You don't know when it's going to happen, right? The steady one, the steady response, is the variable interval because, so the purple is the variable interval. That looks more like a happy face. Because you don't know when you're going to get it, so you constantly, right? So you're constantly going to do it. Where fixed interval, no, so this is like every 60 seconds, the rats get reinforced. So once you get reinforced, then the responses go down. That's why you have this dip. And then when it becomes almost time again, the rats know it's coming. So then you have a lot of responses. Then you get a dip because you know it's not going to happen again for another minute. And that's why it looks like that for fixed interval. And I'll post this video as well. So primary and secondary reinforcement. A primary reinforcement is something that is naturally reinforcing, like food, warmth, water. Right? So you do for things that you need for survival. So if you know of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we're talking about the bottom of his pyramid, right? The biological needs you need for survival. Where secondary reinforcement is something you have learned is a reward because it is paired with a primary reinforcement in the long run, like good grades. right? So money is a secondary reinforcement because you use money to buy food and water and warmth and comfort and all those things. But you can't eat it, right? It's not that biological need. Same thing with like grades, right? You realize good grades get you a good job, which then gets you the money. So those are secondary reinforcements. All right, the last slide is just a chart, just to kind of summarize everything we've talked about. So I'll talk about the classical conditioning side first. This is just a behavior is controlled by the stimuli that precede the response, right? By the conditioned stimulus and the unconditioned stimulus. No reward or punishment is involved, although pleasant and adverse stimuli may be used. Through conditioning, a new stimulus called the conditioned stimulus comes to produce the old reflective behavior. Extinction is produced by withholding the unconditioned stimulus. A learner is passive, so you just act. So it's all about reflex, right? Because this is involuntary. You didn't try to do this; it just happened naturally, right? That is, behaviors elicited by a stimulation. So operant conditioning, the other side, behavior is controlled by consequences. So we talked about rewards and punishments that follow the response. Often involves rewards, reinforcements, which increase behavior, and then punishments, which decrease the behavior. Through conditioning, a new stimulus, which is a reinforcer, produces a new behavior. Extinction is produced by withholding reinforcement. And then lastly, learner is active, right? So responses are voluntary. That is, behavior is emitted by the organism. So remember we talked about at the beginning, the key difference between classical and operant conditioning is classical conditioning is involuntary. You don't really have a choice for it. It happens naturally if you're, you know, exposed to those stimuli. Where operant conditioning, you still have a choice. I might be giving you money to do something, but you still have the choice not to do it and not get that money, right? If you misbehave, you're going to be punished, right? You might have your Xbox taken away, you might get a spanking, whatever it might be, but you still choose whether or not to do that behavior or not. So classical conditioning is involuntary, operant conditioning is voluntary.